The chairman of the Hwarang Syndicate runs into his 8-month pregnant ex-wife, working as a server in a Gangnam nightclub. Seo-Yeon set the tray down, her fingers trembling against the cold glass of the whiskey decanter. Even with her head bowed, she felt the temperature in the VIP booth drop to sub-zero. She knew that presence. She knew that silence. Seo-Yeon. The sound of her name in Jae-Min's low, sandpaper voice after years of exile made her breath hitch. She tried to retreat into the shadows of the club, but his hand moved like lightning, circling her wrist. He didn't squeeze, but the weight of his grip told her the world had just stopped turning. "Look at me," he commanded. She looked up. Jae-Min's eyes were like obsidian, hard, dark, and fractured. The Hwarang soldiers surrounding the table went rigid, their hands hovering near their jackets. Jae-Min's gaze dropped to the unmistakable swell beneath her uniform, a curve she had spent 8 months hiding from the underworld. "How long?" he rasped. "It doesn't matter," she whispered, trying to pull away. Jae-Min stood up slowly, all 6 feet of lethal elegance. This was a man who moved mountains with a whisper, yet his hand on her skin was shaking. "I ended our world to keep you safe from my enemies," he growled, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "But you've been carrying my heir in the dark, while serving my men." Before she could answer, the socialite beside him bristled, her designer jewelry clinking. "Jae-Min, who is this girl?" He didn't blink. Out, everyone out. In 30 seconds, the most powerful man in Seoul had cleared the room, leaving only the pulsing club music and the truth between them. But wait, don't look away yet. This isn't just a reunion. This is a story of a lord of crime who broke his own heart to save a woman, only to find out she chose a life of hardship over a life without him. She believed the lie that she was a liability. He believed the lie that she was gone. To understand how a syndicate king ends up kneeling in a nightclub, we have to go back to the night the war began. Subscribe to this channel to keep getting more exciting stories. The neon pulse of Gangnam never felt like a heartbeat to Han Seo-Yeon. It felt like a countdown. Outside the reinforced glass of Club Azure, the city was a glittering sea of predatory ambition and inherited wealth. But inside the staff locker room, the air smelled of industrial lavender and the metallic tang of unwashed coins. Seo-Yeon leaned her forehead against the cool metal of locker 42, closing her eyes as she tried to coax her swollen feet into the black, sensible flats she had bought from a discount bin in Itaewon. At 8 months pregnant, every movement was a negotiation with gravity. She smoothed the front of her oversized white button-down, a garment she had carefully altered to hide the high, firm curve of her stomach for as long as possible. To the management, she was just me, a quiet, efficient shadow who didn't complain about the double shifts or the way the cigarette smoke clung to her hair. To the rest of the world, she was a ghost. She adjusted her apron, the tie biting into her lower back, and stepped out onto the floor. The transition from the drab backrooms to the main floor of the club was always a shock to the senses. Deep house music throbbed through the soles of her shoes, a relentless bass line that made the baby kick in protest against her ribs. The lighting was a moody, expensive violet, designed to make everyone look like a cinema star and hide the desperation of those serving them. Seo-Yeon moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of a woman who had once been taught how to walk by the finest etiquette tutors in Seoul. She kept her chin down, her gaze fixed on the middle distance. Invisibility was her only armor. For months, she had lived in a 10-by-10 Gasiwon room, sharing a kitchen with students and laborers, eating convenient store triangles of kimbap while staring at the cracks in the ceiling. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the life she had once known as the wife of the Hwarang Syndicate's chairman, but she preferred the hunger to the fear. "Me, stop daydreaming. Section 4 is filling up," her manager, a man named Park with eyes as cold as a winter morning in the Han River, barked over the music. "We have high-profile guests tonight. If I see you sitting down once, I'm docking your tips for the week. Move." Seo-Yeon nodded, her throat tight. "Yes, sir." Section 4 was the most grueling part of the club, a series of semi-private VIP booths that required constant attention and a thick skin. The men who sat there were usually the sons of chaebols or mid-level enforcers who thought a thick wallet gave them the right to touch whatever they pleased. Seo-Yeon had become an expert at the pivotan slide, a movement that allowed her to place a bottle of krug on a table and retreat before a wandering hand could find her waist. As the clock crept toward midnight, the exhaustion began to settle into her bones like lead. Her lower back throbbed with a rhythmic, dull ache that made her breath come in short, shallow hitches. She retreated to the service bar, bracing her hands against the polished mahogany for just a second of relief. "You okay, me?" The bartender, a young guy named Minho who was the only person who knew her real name, whispered as he polished a glass. "You look pale, even for you." "I'm fine," she lied, her voice a fragile thread. "Just the heat." "You shouldn't be here," Minho said, casting a nervous glance toward Manager Park. "Another month and you won't be able to hide it anymore. What are you going to do then?" Seo-Yeon didn't answer. She couldn't. The truth was that she lived in a permanent state of now. If she thought about next month, or even next week, the sheer weight of her situation would crush her. She had walked away from Kang Jae-Min with nothing but a forged divorce paper and the secret growing inside her, believing that her absence was the only thing that would keep her child from becoming a target in the syndicate's war. She had traded a golden cage for a leaden one, and she couldn't afford to regret it. "Order for table 12, the ticket machine hissed. Seo-Yeon took the slip. Her heart performed a strange, jagged stutter in her chest. Table 12 was the center of Section 4, the King's seat. It had been empty all night, reserved for a party that the manager had been frantic about for hours. "Premium whiskey service. The 30-year hibiki," Minho said, his face suddenly losing its color. He set the heavy crystal decanter and 2 glasses onto a silver tray. "Be careful, Seo-Yeon, the people at that table. They aren't the usual Gangnam brats." Seo-Yeon felt a cold shiver slide down her spine, a primal instinct for danger that she had honed during her years at Jae-Min's side. She lifted the tray, the weight of the crystal making her wrists ache. She focused on her breathing, in for 4, out for 4, as she navigated the velvet-lined walkway toward the booth. The air in Section 4 had changed. The usual boisterous laughter and clinking of glasses from the surrounding tables had died down into a low, respectful murmur. 4 men in charcoal suits stood like pillars at the entrance to the booth, their faces devoid of emotion, their eyes scanning the room with lethal efficiency. Seo-Yeon recognized the stance. These weren't hired club security, these were syndicate soldiers. Her blood turned to ice. She considered turning back, dropping the tray, and running out the fire exit into the humid Seoul night. But her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. She was trapped in the gravity of the moment. She told herself it was just a coincidence. Seoul was a city of millions. The Hwarang Syndicate had dozens of high-ranking members. It could be anyone. She reached the edge of the booth. The scent hit her before she saw him, the crisp, expensive aroma of sandalwood and rain, a scent that had once been the only thing that could make her feel safe in a world of violence. Her hands began to shake, the crystal glasses rattling against the silver tray like a warning bell. She kept her head down, her hair falling forward to shroud her face as she stepped into the light of the booth. She saw the edge of a perfectly tailored black suit sleeve. She saw a hand resting on the table, long, powerful fingers, a faint scar running across the knuckle of the index finger. She knew that hand. She had held it in the dark while she cried. She had watched it sign the papers that ended their life together. Seo-Yeon leaned forward to set the bottle down, her center of gravity shifted by the weight of the baby. The movement was clunky, uncoordinated. The tray tilted dangerously. She gasped, catching the edge of the table to steady herself. In that split second, her silence was gone. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the VIP booth seemed to collapse inward. She could feel his gaze, a physical weight burning through the top of her head, searing into the skin of her neck. The man at the table didn't move. He didn't speak, but the air in the room seemed to vanish. Seo-Yeon's breath hitched, a soft, broken sound that echoed in the quiet. She knew she had to leave. She had to turn around and disappear back into the shadows of the club before the recognition turned into a catastrophe. But her feet were rooted to the floor. The baby kicked, a sharp, violent movement that she was sure he could see through the thin fabric of her shirt. Slowly, agonizingly, Seo-Yeon raised her eyes. Kang Jae-Min was exactly as she remembered, and yet he looked like a man who had been carved out of obsidian. His jaw was set in a line of brutal tension, his gray eyes darker than the darkest corners of the club. He looked untouchable, a god of the underworld presiding over a kingdom of glass and sin. Beside him sat a woman Seo-Yeon didn't recognize, a vision of Gangnam perfection in silk and diamonds, but Jae-Min wasn't looking at her. He wasn't looking at the whiskey. He was looking at Seo-Yeon's stomach. The tray in her hands felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The music outside the curtain was 1,000,000 miles away. In the center of Section 4, in the heart of the city that had tried to swallow her whole, Han Seo-Yeon realized that the countdown had finally reached 0. "Seo-Yeon," he whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a sentence. And as his hand shot out to catch her wrist, she knew that the ghost she had spent 8 months becoming had just been hauled back into the light. The silence in the VIP booth was not a lack of sound, but a heavy, pressurized weight that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. Kang Jae-Min's hand remained anchored around Seo-Yeon's wrist, his touch a jarring contrast of searing heat and a slight, nearly imperceptible tremor. His eyes, once described by his enemies as the last thing you see before the dark, were now fixed on her with a raw, agonizing intensity. He didn't look like a man who had won a war. He looked like a man who had realized he'd been fighting the wrong enemy for 8 months. Seo-Yeon tried to pull back, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she feared it might disturb the child within her. But Jae-Min's grip was absolute. He wasn't hurting her. He could never truly hurt her, but he was ensuring she couldn't vanish into the neon shadows again. "How far along are you?" he repeated, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register that made the surrounding air feel cold. I don't know what you're talking about," she whispered, her voice cracking as she leaned into the lie she had told herself every night in her cramped Gasiwon room. Jae-Min stood up slowly, all 6 feet of calculated lethal power unfolding with a grace that silenced the few remaining whispers in the section. He looked at her stomach, the high, unmistakable curve of an 8-month pregnancy, and she saw him count backward in his head. She watched the realization hit him like a physical blow, his jaw clenching so hard it looked as though it might shatter. 8 months, he rasped, the gravel in his voice betraying a surge of barely contained violence. "You have been carrying my child for 8 months, living in the dirt, while I tore this city apart looking for you." The beautiful woman sitting at the table, whose presence had previously felt like a crushing weight on Seo-Yeon's spirit, finally found her voice. "Jae-Min, what is happening? Who is this waitress?" Jae-Min didn't even turn his head. His eyes never left Seo-Yeon's pale face. "Out!" he commanded, the words slicing through the thumping club music like a blade. "Excuse me," the woman protested, her expensive jewelry clinking as she bristled. "We have an arrangement between our families." Jae-Min turned his head just a fraction. The look in his eyes was not one of irritation, it was pure, lethal ice. "I said out, everyone, now." The socialite went pale, her protest dying in her throat as she grabbed her designer purse and fled, her heels clicking a frantic rhythm against the marble floor. Jae-Min's men followed suit without a single word, forming a living wall around the section to ensure total privacy. In less than 30 seconds, the most expensive booth in Seoul was an island of silence in a sea of chaos. "You believed them," Jae-Min said, his voice softer now but no less terrifying. "You believed my sister when she told you I wanted a proper woman. You believed the papers she signed in my name." "The signature was real, Jae-Min," Seo-Yeon argued, her own strength flickering to life. "You were gone. You didn't come home for days. What was I supposed to think?" "I was ending the people who threatened you," he roared, the sound making her flinch. He immediately checked his volume, his hand on her wrist softening as he saw her distress. "She forged it. I told her I would burn this city to the ground before I let you go, and she sent you to live in a hole while you were carrying my heir." He turned toward the edge of the booth where the club manager stood trembling. Jae-Min didn't ask questions. He pulled out his phone and made a series of rapid calls in Korean, his words sharp and final. Seo-Yeon caught only fragments. Acquisition, immediate transfer, escort them out. What are you doing? She asked, a sense of dread pooling in her stomach. I just bought this club, he said, hanging up the phone and looking past her to the manager. You are fired, effective immediately. My men will see to the paperwork tomorrow. Before Seo-Yeon could protest the loss of the only income that kept her alive, Jae-Min was moving. He didn't ask if she was ready to leave. He simply moved his hand to the small of her back, a gesture that was both a claim and a protection. We are leaving, he said. I have a shift, Jae-Min. I have a life. You have a child, he countered, his gaze dropping again to her belly. My child, and you are malnourished, your hands are shaking, and you are standing in a den of vipers. This ends now. He guided her through the club, his men materializing from the shadows to form a phalanx around them. The patrons stared, their whispers cut short by the sheer aura of violence radiating from the chairman. Outside, the night air was thick with the scent of rain and exhaust, but the black Mercedes waiting at the curb was a sanctuary of climate-controlled silence. Jae-Min helped her into the back seat with a tenderness that felt like a haunting memory of their early days. The interior of the car smelled of him, rich leather and expensive cologne, and for a moment, Seo-Yeon felt the 6 months of exhaustion and hunger threaten to pull her under. As they drove toward the Han River, the bright lights of Gangnam blurred into streaks of neon. Jae-Min sat beside her, his body rigid. He didn't speak until they passed the station in Itaewon, near the cramped Gasiwon she called home. Where were you staying? He asked, his voice low. A room near the station, she replied, staring out the window. She heard his sharp intake of breath. When she looked over, his knuckles were white as he gripped the armrest. A Gasiwon, you have been living in a shoebox while carrying my daughter. I survived, she said simply. You should never have had to survive me, Seo-Yeon, he whispered, a flash of genuine pain crossing his face. The car pulled into the underground garage of his Hanamdong estate, the fortress she had once thought was her home. The elevator ride up to the penthouse was a blur of silence and rising panic. She didn't want to go back. She didn't want to be a bird in a gilded cage again. But when the doors opened directly into the living room, Seo-Yeon stopped dead. Everything was exactly as she had left it. Her books were still on the shelves, organized by the color of their spines. Her favorite blanket was folded over the back of the sofa. And by the window, her collection of plants wasn't just alive. They were thriving, their green leaves vibrant against the glass. You kept them alive, she breathed, walking toward a snake plant she had bought on their first anniversary. I watched videos, Jae-Min said from behind her, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't hide. I set reminders on my phone. I talked to them because you said it made them grow. He stood just inches away from her, the power and the guilt of him filling the room. This was always your home, Seo-Yeon. You never left it, not in my mind. Seo-Yeon turned to face him, the weight of her 8-month journey finally catching up to her. She saw the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes, the weariness of a man who had been at war with the world and himself. I'm tired, Jae-Min, she whispered. I know, he said, reaching out to graze her cheek with his thumb. But you're safe now, and tomorrow. The world will know that the chairman's wife has come home. He didn't see the flicker of fear in her eyes at the word wife. He only saw the child she carried, and the empire he would now burn to protect them both. The penthouse was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of the air filtration system and the distant, muffled pulse of the city below. Seo-Yeon lay in the center of the massive bed she had once shared with Jae-Min, but sleep was a phantom she couldn't catch. Every time she closed her eyes, the plush silk sheets beneath her felt like the cold, hard floor of the Gasiwon, and the silence of the room felt like the breath before a scream. Her mind, fueled by the exhaustion of the night, betrayed her, dragging her back to the night the world ended. It had been 18 months ago, a Tuesday that smelled of impending rain. The Hwarang estate had been under a state of high alert for weeks. The air was thick with the copper tang of blood and the acrid scent of gunpowder. A rival faction from Busan had been making aggressive moves on their northern territories, and Jae-Min had become a ghost in his own home, a shadow that moved between war rooms and secure phone lines. Seo-Yeon had been waiting for him in the library, her hands folded over a book she couldn't read. When the heavy oak doors finally swung open, Jae-Min hadn't walked in. He had stumbled. His charcoal suit jacket was gone, his white dress shirt was crimson at the shoulder, and his eyes were wild, the eyes of a man who had looked into the abyss and realized it was looking back. "Pack a bag," he had said, his voice a jagged edge of gravel. "Jae-Min, you're bleeding. Let me call the doctor." "I said pack a bag, Seo-Yeon." He had slammed his hand against the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "They hit the convoy. They know where you go. They know the color of your car. My protection isn't enough anymore. You're a target." "I don't care about being a target," she had cried, moving toward him, her heart breaking at the sight of his vulnerability. "I care about you. We can go to the safe house in Jeju. We can leave the country." He had looked at her then, and for the first time in their marriage, there was no love in his gaze, only a cold, calculated distance that made her skin crawl. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a single sheet of paper. He slid it across the mahogany surface toward her. "Sign it," he commanded. Seo-Yeon's breath had hitched. At the top of the page, in bold, clinical font, were the words, "Joint petition for divorce." "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, Jae-Min, I won't. I'm your wife." "You are a liability," he had roared, stepping into her space, his height used as a weapon to cow her. "Look at me. Look at this life. Every time I leave this house, I wonder if I'll come back to find you in pieces. I can't lead an army when I'm terrified for a woman who has no business being in this world. You were a mistake, Seo-Yeon, a distraction I can no longer afford." The words had been more surgical than any blade. She remembered the way her throat had tightened, the way the room had seemed to tilt on its axis. She had looked for a flicker of a lie in his eyes, a sign that this was a ruse to push her away for her own safety. But Jae-Min had spent years perfecting his mask. He looked at her with the same indifference he showed to a failed business merger. "Is that all I am?" she had asked, her voice small and hollow. "A distraction?" "You are a weakness," he replied, his voice dropping to a low, cruel hiss. "And in the Hwarang, weakness is purged. If you stay, you die. If you leave as my wife, they track you. If you leave as a woman I discarded, a woman I humiliated and replaced, you become invisible, you become safe." He had leaned over her, forcing the pen into her hand. His touch had been cold, devoid of the warmth that used to settle her soul. "Sign it, Seo-Yeon. Sign it and take the payout. Go back to the life you had before you met me. Forget my name. Forget this house. If I see you again after tonight, I won't recognize you." With shaking hands, she had signed. She had signed because she believed that her presence was truly killing him. She had signed because she loved him enough to let him believe he was free of his weakness. But as she walked out of the estate that night with a single suitcase, she hadn't known that Jae-Min's sister, the calculating and cruel Hana, was waiting in the shadows of the foyer. Hana had intercepted her before she reached the gate, her face a mask of false sympathy. "He didn't want to be the one to tell you," Hana had whispered, pressing a folder of photos into Seo-Yeon's hands. "But there's a daughter of the O family, a woman who understands our traditions, a woman who can give him the heirs he needs. Jae-Min needs power, Seo-Yeon, not a server from a middle-class family who makes him soft. He didn't just sign those papers to save you. He signed them to replace you." Seo-Yeon had looked at the photos, grainy shots of Jae-Min at a gala with a beautiful, poised woman. She hadn't stayed to hear the rest. She had run into the rain, the grief a physical weight in her chest. 2 weeks later, in a cheap motel in Busan, she had looked at a plastic stick with 2 pink lines and realized that the distraction had left a permanent mark. The memory shifted, blurring into the present. Seo-Yeon sat up in the bed, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She looked around the darkened penthouse. It was exactly the same, yet entirely different. The door to the bedroom creaked open, a sliver of golden light spilling across the carpet. Jae-Min stood there, his frame silhouetted against the hallway. He had discarded his suit jacket and tie, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar. He looked less like a king and more like a man who was haunted by his own ghost. "You're awake," he said softly. "I was remembering," she replied, her voice cold. "I was remembering the night you told me I was a mistake, the night you forced that pen into my hand." Jae-Min flinched. He walked into the room, stopping at the foot of the bed. He didn't try to touch her. He knew he hadn't earned that right yet. "I told you what I had to tell you so you would run far enough that my enemies couldn't find you. I thought if you hated me, you would stay away from the fire. And while you were playing God with my life, your sister was making sure I felt like nothing," Seo-Yeon said, her eyes flashing with a dormant fire. "She told me about the O family. She told me you were ashamed of me." Jae-Min's expression shifted, the mask of the chairman slipping to reveal a terrifying, murderous rage directed at the memory of his sister's interference. "Hana, she will answer for every word she spoke to you. I never looked at another woman. I never even let another person sit in your chair at the table. I spent 6 months liquidating every faction that participated in that hit, thinking that once the city was red with their blood, I could finally go and find you." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But I found you in a bar, Seo-Yeon, carrying a child I didn't know existed, working until your feet bled. My protection was the cruelest thing I ever did to you." Seo-Yeon looked at him, the most dangerous man in Seoul, and saw the tears he refused to let fall. She placed a hand on her stomach, feeling the baby move. "You didn't protect me, Jae-Min. You abandoned me." "I know," he said, and the words sounded like a confession. "And I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to be strong alone again. But right now, you need to eat, and the doctor is on his way." The mention of a doctor brought back the reality of her situation. She wasn't just a woman in a penthouse. She was an 8-month pregnant woman whose body was beginning to fail under the weight of her sacrifices. The ghost of the Hwarang was still in the room, but as Jae-Min reached out, his hand hesitating before finally resting gently on the curve of her belly, the past began to bleed into a terrifying, uncertain future. "He's kicking," Jae-Min breathed, his eyes wide with a wonder that erased the chairman entirely. "It's a girl," Seo-Yeon corrected him, her voice softening despite herself. Jae-Min froze. A slow, heartbreaking smile touched his lips. "A daughter, I have a daughter." In that moment, the violent night of the divorce seemed a lifetime away, but the shadows of the syndicate still loomed at the door, waiting for a chance to strike at the chairman's only weakness. The golden light of the morning sun spilled across the Italian marble floors of the penthouse, but to Seo-Yeon, it felt like the cold glow of a spotlight in an interrogation room. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the ant-like movement of traffic far below on the Olympic Expressway. Up here, the world was silent, sterilized, and impossibly expensive. Down there, she had been free, hungry, exhausted, and frightened, yes, but she had been the master of her own footsteps. A soft chime echoed through the suite, followed by the silent glide of the motorized doors. Jae-Min entered, no longer wearing the sharp, intimidating suit of the syndicate chairman, but a charcoal cashmere sweater that made him look deceptively soft. Behind him, 2 domestic staff members trailed silently, pushing a cart laden with silver cloches and fresh porcelain. "You haven't touched the bed," Jae-Min noted, his gaze sweeping over the perfectly smooth silk sheets. His voice was low, devoid of the gravelly edge from the night before, yet it still commanded the air around him. "I'm not a guest, Jae-Min, and I'm certainly not a prisoner," Seo-Yeon said, not turning to face him. She kept her hand protectively over the crest of her stomach, where the baby was unusually still, perhaps sensing the atmospheric pressure of the man in the room. "You're home," he countered. He signaled for the staff to leave. They vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving the scent of white truffles and fresh-pressed orange juice in their wake. "I've had the chef prepare a menu specifically for prenatal nutrition. High iron, folic acid, 0 sodium. You're pale, Seo-Yeon. You need to eat." Seo-Yeon finally turned, her eyes flashing with a spark of the defiance that had kept her alive in the slums of Itaewon. "I don't want your chef. I don't want your silk sheets. Every time I look at this room, I don't see luxury. I see the walls that make you a target. I see the reasons why our child will never be able to play in a park without 4 men in suits standing over her. Jae-Min's expression didn't flicker, but the muscle in his jaw tightened. He walked toward the dining table, uncovering a plate of delicate, steamed abalone and nutrient-rich porridge. The world outside is not safer than this room. You were working in a club owned by vipers, serving men who would sell their mothers for a fraction of my influence. You think that was freedom? That was a slow death. It was my life, she snapped, stepping toward him, her shadow stretching long across the marble. I lived in a room the size of your walk-in closet, but I didn't have to check the perimeter for assassins before I went asleep. I didn't have to worry about whose blood was on the money paying for my bread. The tension between them stretched thin, a vibrating wire ready to snap. Jae-Min pulled out a chair, his eyes fixed on hers. It wasn't an invitation. It was a silent command wrapped in the guise of a gesture. Sit. Eat. We can argue about the philosophy of your freedom once your blood pressure isn't at a dangerous low. Seo-Yeon felt the familiar weight of his will pressing down on her. It was the same gravity that had drawn her to him years ago, the magnetic pull of a man who could steady the world with a look. But she remained standing. Is this how it's going to be? She whispered. You buy the club so I can't work. You bring me here so I can't leave. You replace my life with a curated list of vitamins and security protocols. You're not protecting me, Jae-Min. You're just putting me back in the vault where you keep your most valuable assets. Jae-Min stood up, his height suddenly overwhelming the small space between them. He didn't reach for her, but the air seemed to hum with his proximity. If I were treating you like an asset, I would have put you in a safe house in the mountains with a 12 guards and a locked gate. Instead, I brought you here, to my bed, to the heart of my life. Your life is a war zone, Seo-Yeon cried, her voice cracking. Do you think I forgot the night you came home with your shoulder shattered? Do you think I forgot the phone calls you took in the middle of the night that ended in people disappearing? I left because I couldn't breathe in the scent of gunpowder anymore. And now you've brought me back right as the fire is getting hotter. Jae-Min reached out then, his hand hesitating before he brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His fingers were warm, a stark contrast to the cold marble under her feet. The fire is being extinguished. I have spent the last 6 months systematically dismantling every faction that dared to look at this house. I didn't do it for the syndicate. I did it so that when I found you, there would be no more war. There is always a war for men like you, she said sadly, leaning away from his touch. If it's not the Busan faction, it will be the Interpol. If it's not them, it's your own board of directors. Your life is built on a foundation of enemies, Jae-Min, and I won't let my daughter be the mortar that holds it together. She walked away from him, heading toward the hallway that led to the guest wing, far from the master's suite they had once shared. Where are you going? He asked, his voice regaining that edge of steel. To a room with a lock, she replied. I'll eat your food because she needs it. I'll stay here because I have no money and no home left thanks to you. But don't mistake my presence for a reconciliation. You are a stranger to me now, a man who chose power over his wife and who thinks a penthouse can make up for 6 months of silence. Jae-Min watched her go, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He could handle a gang war. He could handle a hostile takeover. But the quiet, steady rejection from the woman he had burned the city to find was a wound he didn't know how to cauterize. As Seo-Yeon reached the door to the guest room, she paused, her back to him. And Jae-Min, tell your men to stop standing outside my door. It doesn't make me feel safe. It just reminds me that I'm in a cage. She closed the door, the soft click of the latch echoing through the vast, empty luxury of the penthouse. Inside the room, she sank onto the edge of the bed and finally let the tears fall. She looked at the room, filled with fresh flowers, designer maternity wear, and every comfort imaginable, and felt a profound sense of mourning. She was back in his world, surrounded by his wealth and his violence. The prisoner of the Hwarang had returned to her cell, and though the bars were made of gold and the guard was the man she still desperately loved, the danger was closer than it had ever been. She could feel it in the way the shadows moved in the hallway, and in the way Jae-Min looked at her, like a man who would destroy the world to keep her, never realizing that he was the very thing she needed protection from. Outside, in the living room, Ye-min picked up the untouched glass of orange juice and shattered it against the fireplace. The sound of breaking glass was the only answer the penthouse had to give. He looked at the closed door, his eyes dark with a terrifying resolve. He had her back. That was all that mattered. He would find a way to make her love the cage, or he would burn the rest of the world down until the cage was the only thing left standing. The afternoon sun had begun to dip behind the skyscrapers of Seoul, casting long, skeletal shadows across the penthouse floor, when the heavy oak doors of the study creaked open. Ye-min did not look up from the tablet in his hands. He was a man accustomed to balance sheets and tactical maps, but the document currently glowing on the screen was a different kind of war report. It was the medical file from the private obstetrician he had summoned to examine Seo-Yeon that morning. He had expected to find a list of vitamins she needed or perhaps a recommendation for bed rest. Instead, the words on the screen felt like ice water in his veins. Severe anemia, malnutrition-induced electrolyte imbalance, chronic stress markers, placental insufficiency risks. Ye-min's fingers tightened around the edge of the device until the glass groaned. He had forced her out of his life to keep her safe from bullets, but while he had been scouring the criminal underworld for her, she had been slowly starving in the middle of the most affluent city in Asia. His protection had stripped her of her name, her home, and the basic nutrients required to grow a human life. A soft knock interrupted his spiraling thoughts. Dr. Choi, a man who had stitched up the syndicate's most brutal wounds for decades, stepped into the room. He didn't offer his usual professional smile. "I've finished the comprehensive blood panel, Chairman," the doctor said, his voice unusually somber. "I'll be blunt. If you hadn't found her last night, I don't think she would have made it to her due date, and neither would the child." The air left Ye-min's lungs. "Explain." "She's been surviving on a diet of mostly instant noodles and water for months. Her body is prioritizing the fetus, but there's nothing left in her reserves. Her heart is under immense strain," Dr. Choi explained, laying a printed report on the desk. "She has calluses on her feet from standing 10 hours a day, and her blood pressure is erratic." "She isn't just tired, Chairman. She's depleted. Mentally and physically, she's been running on a battery that ran out of charge weeks ago." Ye-min stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the floor. He walked to the window, staring out at the city he supposedly ruled. He was the most powerful man in the Hwarang Syndicate, yet he had let his wife, the only person who made his cold heartbeat, fade away in a dingy room while he played soldier. "Fix it," Ye-min rasped, his back to the doctor. "Whatever she needs, the best specialists, the highest quality supplements. I want a nurse stationed here 24 hours a day." "She has already refused the nurse, sir," Dr. Choi said quietly. "She says she isn't an invalid, and honestly, Chairman, more than medicine, she needs peace. Her cortisol levels are through the roof. Every time one of your security guards walks past her door, her heart rate spikes. If you want her to recover, you need to make her feel like she isn't in a fortress, even if she is." Ye-min dismissed the doctor with a curt nod and headed toward the guest wing. He found Seo-Yeon in the small sunroom he had converted into a temporary dining area. She was sitting at the table, staring at a bowl of nutrient-dense porridge as if it were a bowl of poison. She looked fragile in the sunlight, her collarbones too prominent, the skin under her eyes bruised with a fatigue that no amount of sleep could fix. He didn't speak as he sat across from her. He simply picked up the spoon and held it out to her. "I can feed myself, Ye-min," she said, her voice a hollow echo of the defiance she had shown earlier. "The doctor gave me his report," he said, ignoring her protest. His hand didn't waver. "He told me that you've been starving. He told me that you nearly killed yourself trying to hide from me." Seo-Yeon looked at him then, and the sadness in her eyes was more devastating than any blade. "I wasn't trying to kill myself, Ye-min. I was trying to exist without you. Do you know how hard that is in this city? When you have no references, no family, and a stomach that keeps growing. I didn't care about the food. I just wanted to make enough money to pay for the delivery so she wouldn't be born in a hallway." Ye-min's heart fractured. He set the spoon down and reached across the table, covering her small, cold hand with his. "I thought I was being a hero. I thought by sending you away with that divorce, I was giving you a life. I never imagined you would end up in a place like that." Because you only think in terms of power, Ye-min, she whispered, a single tear escaping and tracing a path down her pale cheek. You thought money and a clean break would be enough. You didn't realize that in your world, a woman alone with nothing is just prey. Your sister made sure I couldn't access the settlement money. She told the banks it was a fraudulent claim. I had nothing. Ye-min froze. The mention of the settlement money, the millions he had tucked away to ensure her comfort, being blocked was the final piece of the puzzle. His own blood had sabotaged the only good thing he had ever done. The rage that flickered in his chest was white-hot, a silent promise of the carnage he would visit upon anyone who had touched her life during his absence. Eat, he said, his voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming tenderness. Please, Seo-Yeon, not for me, for her. She looked at him for a long moment, searching for the monster she had fled, but finding only a man who looked like he was drowning in his own regret. Slowly, she took the spoon from his hand and began to eat. The silence that followed wasn't the pressurized tension of the previous night. It was a heavy, mournful quiet. Ye-min watched her, nodding the way she winced when she shifted her weight, the way her hand shook slightly as she lifted the water glass. Every sign of her struggle was a brand on his soul. He realized then that his protection had been the greatest threat of all. He had been so focused on the enemies at the gate that he hadn't seen the walls crumbling from the inside. I'm going to find out who blocked that money, he said, his voice a low, terrifying promise. And I'm going to make sure they never draw a breath of clean air again. No more blood, Ye-min, Seo-Yeon said, setting the spoon down. That's why I left. If you want me to stay, if you want to be a father to this girl, you have to stop solving everything with a funeral. Ye-min looked at her, this woman who had endured more in 6 months than most of his soldiers did in a lifetime, and he felt a shift in his own foundation. He had spent his life building a throne of bones, thinking it was the only way to keep what was his. But as he looked at Seo-Yeon's frail form, he realized that if he didn't change, he would be the king of a graveyard. I will do whatever it takes, he vowed, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. If it means burning the syndicate to the ground to keep you safe and fed, I'll strike the match myself. Seo-Yeon didn't pull her hand away this time. She let him hold it, a fragile bridge over a canyon of lies and pain. She didn't trust him yet. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford. But as she finished the meal, she felt the first flicker of strength returning to her limbs. Ye-min stayed with her until she finished every bite, his presence a silent, suffocating sentinel. He had found her, and he had saved her from the slow death of the streets. But as he watched her sleep later that afternoon, he knew the real battle hadn't even begun. He had to convince her that his love wasn't just another cage, and he had to do it before his enemies, or his own family, found a way to finish what the hunger had started. He stepped out onto the balcony, the report still clutched in his hand. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years. Start the liquidation of the Hwarang holdings, he commanded the moment the call connected. Everything. I want a clean ledger, and find my sister. Tell her the chairman wants to have a family dinner. The tone of his voice was like a death knell. He had seen the malnutrition report, and now the city was going to feel the hunger of his vengeance. The calm that had settled over the penthouse following Ye-min's vow was a fragile illusion, a thin layer of ice over a dark, churning river. While Seo-Yeon slept, her body finally beginning to absorb the nutrients and peace she had been denied for months, the machinery of the Hwarang Syndicate was grinding into a high-octane gear. Ye-min had not left her bedside for more than an hour at a time, but his phone was a constant, silent glow of encrypted messages and tactical updates. The world outside the penthouse didn't stop moving just because he had found his heart. If anything, his enemies had smelled the shift in the air. A man with a secret is a man with a target, and a man with a pregnant wife is a man with a crosshair on his back. Ye-min stood in the darkened kitchen, the only light coming from the city skyline through the reinforced glass. He was nursing a glass of water, his eyes fixed on the security monitors tucked discreetly into the cabinetry. His chief of security, a silent giant named Sang-hoon, appeared in the doorway like a ghost. He didn't need to speak for Ye-min to know the news was bad. They found the club trail, Sang-hoon said, his voice a low rumble. The Busan faction, the Namgu crew, they've been questioning the staff at Club Azure. They know you bought the place out of nowhere, and they know you left with a woman. They're putting the pieces together, Chairman. They know she wasn't just a waitress. Yi-min's grip on the glass tightened. The Namgu crew were scavengers, led by a man named Kang Jae who had been waiting for a single crack in Yi-min's armor for a decade. Increase the perimeter. I want double teams on the service elevators and the rooftop. If a bird lands on this balcony that isn't registered, I want it plucked. It's more than just surveillance, sir, Sang-hoon continued, stepping closer. Our scouts intercepted a delivery truck 3 blocks away. It wasn't carrying produce. It was carrying hardware, high-velocity rifles, and thermal imaging. They aren't looking to kidnap her. They're looking to send a message. The implication was clear. To the Underworld, Seo-Yeon wasn't a person. She was a strategic vulnerability. If they couldn't break the Hwarang's front line, they would cut out its heart. Yi-min felt a surge of protective fury that threatened to drown his calculated logic. He looked toward the hallway where Seo-Yeon was finally resting, her breathing steady for the first time in 8 months. They won't get within a mile of her, Yi-min vowed. But don't engage until they cross the line. I want them to think we're still in the investigation phase. Let them walk into the trap. The night dragged on, a suffocating vigil of shadows and radio static. Inside the master suite, Seo-Yeon stirred. The heavy silence of the penthouse, which usually felt like a cage, now felt like a pressurized chamber. She sat up, rubbing her lower back as a sharp, sudden cramp bloomed in her abdomen. It wasn't the usual kick of the baby. It was a tightening, a tension that radiated from her spine. Yi-min, she called out, her voice thin in the vast room. The door opened instantly. He didn't look like the man who had been talking about liquidation and hardware minutes ago. He looked like a husband. I'm here. Are you in pain? I feel strange, she whispered, her hand trembling as she gripped the silk duvet. Everything feels too quiet. Why are there so many lights on the balcony? Yi-min crossed the room in 3 long strides, sitting on the edge of the bed and taking her hand. He didn't want to tell her that a hit squad was currently circling the block. He didn't want to tell her that the safe home he had promised was about to become a kill zone. It's just a standard security drill, Seo-Yeon. You've been through a lot. Your body is reacting to the stress. Don't lie to me, she said, her eyes searching his. I know that look. That's the look you had the night of the divorce. Something is coming, isn't it? Before he could offer another sanitized truth, the glass of the balcony windows vibrated. It wasn't a loud sound, just a dull, metallic thud, but to Yi-min it was a thunderclap, a grappling hook. Sang-hoon, now! Yi-min barked into the mic clipped to his collar, his hand flying to the holster at the small of his back. In a heartbeat, the sterilized luxury of the penthouse vanished. The lights cut out, plunged into the red glow of the emergency system. Outside, the silent night was shattered by the rhythmic pop-pop-pop of suppressed gunfire. Get down, Yi-min commanded, shielding Seo-Yeon's body with his own as he rolled her off the bed and toward the reinforced panic room hidden behind the walk-in closet. Seo-Yeon gasped, her hands clenching his shirt. Yi-min, the baby. I have you, he hissed, his eyes darting to the door as it hissed open. Sang-hoon and 2 other men burst in, their tactical vests gleaming in the red light. They're on the terrace, Chairman. 6 men, professional grade. We've neutralized 4, but they've breached the kitchen. The sound of shattering glass echoed from the other end of the penthouse, the sound of his home being violated. Yi-min felt a cold, surgical rage settle over him. He shoved Seo-Yeon into the panic room, a small, high-tech bunker filled with medical supplies and monitors. Stay here. Do not open this door for anyone but me or Sang-hoon. Do you understand? Seo-Yeon's face was ghost-white, her eyes wide with the realization that the war she had fled had finally knocked on her door. Yi-min, please, don't go. I am the wall between them and you, he said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. He leaned in, pressing his forehead against hers for a fleeting second. I failed you for 6 months. I will not fail you for 6 seconds tonight. He shut the door, the heavy steel bolts sliding into place with a definitive clack. Out in the living room, the scene was a chaotic ballet of violence. The Namgu crew had underestimated the chairman's personal guard. Jae-Min moved through the shadows of his own home with the lethal efficiency of a predator. He didn't use his gun unless he had to. He was a master of the close-quarters kill. He caught the first intruder near the piano, a quick, brutal snap of the neck that left the man crumpled on the marble. The second was blinded by a flashbang and taken down by Jae-Min's blade before he could even scream. But as Jae-Min stepped over the body, he saw the security monitor in the hallway. A third team wasn't coming for the penthouse. They were at the electrical substation for the building. "They're going to cut the air," Sang-hoon shouted over the comms. "Chairman, they're trying to smoke you out or suffocate the panic room." Jae-Min looked at the door where Seo-Yeon was trapped. The panic room had its own oxygen supply, but only for 6 hours. If they lost power to the building, the elevators would freeze, and they would be trapped on the 80th floor while the Namgu crew brought in reinforcements. He realized then that the penthouse wasn't just a cage, it was a tomb. "Clear the service stairs," Jae-Min ordered. "We're moving her. Get the armored transport into the basement now." He ran back to the panic room, his heart hammering against his ribs. When he opened the door, he found Seo-Yeon doubled over on the floor, her face contorted in agony. "Seo-Yeon, what is it? Did they hit you?" "No," she gasped, her hand clutching her lower abdomen. "Jae-Min, the stress, I think. The baby is coming." Jae-Min went completely still. The rhythmic gunfire continued in the hallway. His enemies were closing in. The power was flickering, and his 8-month pregnant wife, malnourished and exhausted, was going into labor in the middle of a war zone. "Sang-hoon," Jae-Min said into the radio, his voice sounding like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Tell the hospital to clear the floor, and tell the Namgu crew. Tell them that if my daughter is born today, it will be the last day their families ever see the sun." He scooped Seo-Yeon up in his arms, her weight feeling like both the world and nothing at all. As he stepped out into the hallway, over the blood and the broken glass of his empire, the blood on the horizon wasn't just a threat anymore. It was the reality of the price he had to pay to be a father. The descent from the penthouse was a blur of tactical precision and primal terror. Jae-Min held Seo-Yeon against his chest, her weight shifted by the agonizing tightness of her contractions, as the service elevator plunged toward the basement. The lights flickered, casting strobe-like flashes over Sang-hoon and the 4 Hwarang soldiers who stood with weapons drawn, their bodies forming a human shield around their chairman and his unborn child. Seo-Yeon's breath came in ragged, shallow gasps, her fingers digging into the charcoal cashmere of Jae-Min's sweater. "It's too early," she choked out, a sob hitching in her throat as another wave of pain rolled through her. "Jae-Min, she's not ready. It's only 8 months." "She is a daughter of the Hwarang," Jae-Min whispered into her hair, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. "She is as strong as her mother. Hold on to me, Seo-Yeon, just hold on." The elevator doors hissed open to the basement garage, where the air was thick with the smell of wet concrete and exhaust. 2 armored black SUVs sat idling, their headlights cutting through the gloom. As they moved toward the vehicles, a hail of gunfire erupted from the shadows of the concrete pillars. The Namgu crew had anticipated the escape route. "Go, go!" Sang-hoon roared, returning fire as Jae-Min ducked into the back of the lead SUV, shielding Seo-Yeon with his own body. The reinforced glass spiderwebbed as bullets hammered against the exterior, but the vehicle surged forward, tires screaming as it tore out of the garage and onto the rain-slicked streets of Seoul. The drive to the Hwarang-owned private medical center was a high-speed gauntlet. Jae-Min didn't look out the window at the chasing headlights or the sparks flying from the mechanical skirmish trailing behind them. His world had narrowed down to the woman in his arms and the erratic rhythm of her labor. He watched the sweat bead on her forehead, the way her skin turned a translucent, ghostly white. Every minute they spent in transit was a minute the baby's heart rate was under duress. By the time they skidded into the hospital's secure ambulance bay, a specialized medical team was already waiting. Jae-Min didn't wait for the doors to be opened from the outside. He kicked his way out, carrying Seo-Yeon onto a waiting gurney. "Clear the wing," Jae-Min commanded, his voice echoing through the sterile white corridors. "I want a full lockdown. No one enters this floor without my personal clearance." As Seo-Yeon was wheeled into the emergency delivery suite, Dr. Choi met them, his surgical mask already in place. He took one look at Seo-Yeon's monitor, the heart rate of the baby dipping dangerously low with every contraction, and his face hardened. "Chairman, the stress has triggered a partial placental abruption," Dr. Choi said, his tone urgent as he walked alongside the moving gurney. "Her blood pressure is skyrocketing. We can't wait for a natural birth. We have to go to surgery now. If we don't, we lose them both." Jae-Min stopped at the double doors of the operating theater. He felt the cold realization sink into his marrow. This was a battle he couldn't win with a gun or a blade. He reached out, his hand shaking as he touched Seo-Yeon's cheek one last time before they took her in. "I'll be right outside," he promised, his voice cracking. "I'm not leaving you again." "Jae-Min," she gasped, her eyes searching his with a desperate, final intensity. If you have to choose her." "I am not choosing," he growled, the king returning to his eyes. "I am keeping you both." The doors swung shut, and for the first time in his life, Kang Jae-Min felt the crushing weight of helplessness. He stood in the sterile hallway, the silence of the hospital a jarring contrast to the violence he had just escaped. But the silence didn't last. The elevator at the end of the hall chimed. Sang-hoon stepped out, his suit jacket torn, blood splattered across his cheek. "Chairman, they've breached the lobby. Kang-di isn't letting this go. He's brought 50 men. They're coming up the stairwells." Jae-Min looked at the closed doors of the operating room. Inside, the woman he loved was being cut open to save a life he hadn't known existed 48 hours ago. Outside, the world was coming to take it all away. He reached down and picked up a discarded tactical rifle from the floor, checking the magazine with a grim, rhythmic efficiency. He stripped off his blood-stained sweater, revealing the scars on his shoulders and the holster strapped to his chest. He looked less like a chairman now and more like a demon of the underworld. "Sang-hoon, take the north stairwell," Jae-Min ordered, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Tell the men there is no retreat. If a single one of those scavengers sets foot on this floor, I will hold you personally responsible for the funeral arrangements." "And you, sir." Jae-Min stepped into the center of the hallway, directly in front of the operating room doors. He was the final barrier. "I'm staying here. I am the wall." The sound of heavy boots echoed from the stairwell. The lights in the hallway flickered as the Namgu crew cut the main breakers, leaving the floor bathed in the eerie, pulsating red of the emergency generators. Jae-Min stood in the crimson light, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the white walls. The first wave of attackers burst through the doors. They weren't soldiers. They were street thugs, fueled by the promise of a bounty and the chance to kill a legend. Jae-Min didn't give them a chance to speak. The hallway exploded into a cacophony of gunfire and screams. He fought with a desperation that was terrifying to behold. He wasn't just defending a territory or a business interest. He was defending the very breath of his family. He moved through the red light like a wraith, his movements precise and lethal. When his rifle ran dry, he transitioned to his handgun. When that was gone, he used his bare hands and the jagged edges of the environment. He was hit, a graze across his thigh, a blunt force blow to his ribs, but he didn't feel the pain. He only felt the rhythmic thudding of the life support machines through the wall behind him. He was the shepherd, and the wolves were at the gate. Back inside the operating room, the sounds of the battle were muffled, filtered through the thick, lead-lined walls. Dr. Choi's hands were steady even as the building vibrated from a distant explosion. He looked at the monitor. "Scalpel, we're in! Steady, everyone. We have one shot at this." Seo-Yeon drifted in the gray space between consciousness and the abyss. She could hear the faint, metallic clatter of instruments and the muffled thump-thump-thump of the war outside. But more than that, she felt the presence of the man at the door. She felt Jae-Min's rage and his love, a singular burning force that seemed to be holding the very roof over her head. "I choose you," she whispered into the anesthesia, her heart rate slowing as her body finally gave up the fight. Outside, Jae-Min was down to his last magazine. He stood over a pile of fallen men, his breathing heavy, his vision blurred by sweat and blood. He heard the elevator chime again, more reinforcements. He braced himself, his finger tightening on the trigger, ready to die on this spot. But then, a sound broke through the noise of the combat. It wasn't a gunshot, it wasn't a scream. It was a thin, high-pitched wail. A sharp, insistent cry that pierced through the heavy hospital doors and the thick air of the hallway. The sound of a new life. Jae-Min froze. His hand trembled on the grip of his weapon. The cry was small, but to him, it was louder than any explosion. It was the sound of his daughter claiming her place in a world that had tried to deny her existence. The attackers at the end of the hall hesitated, unnerved by the sudden, terrifying change in the chairman's aura. Jae-Min looked at them, and for the first time that night, he smiled. It was a cold, predatory expression that promised 1,000 years of suffering. "Did you hear that?" Jae-Min asked, his voice a low, vibrating growl. "That's the sound of the Hwarang's future, and it's the last thing you're ever going to hear." As he moved forward to finish the fight, the light in the hallway suddenly shifted from red back to a brilliant, blinding white. The backup power had fully engaged. At that moment, the doors to the operating room opened. Dr. Choi stepped out, his scrubs soaked in blood, but his eyes were shining. He held a small, bundled shape in his arms, a tiny, screaming miracle wrapped in a hospital blanket. "A girl, Chairman," the doctor said, his voice breaking the tension of the battlefield. "She's small, but she's breathing, and Seo-Yeon, she's stable, she's sleeping." Jae-Min dropped his gun. The heavy metal clattered onto the tile floor, a sound of surrender to a power greater than violence. He took a step toward his daughter, his blood-stained hands reaching out with a gentleness that defied his reputation. The war wasn't over. There were still bodies in the hall and enemies in the city. But as Jae-Min looked down at the wrinkled, red face of his child, he knew the emergency ward had become a sanctuary. He was no longer just a lord of crime. He was a father, and God help anyone who tried to take that from him. The antiseptic smell of the hospital's high-security wing usually signified healing. But as Kang Jae-Min stood by the reinforced glass of the neonatal intensive care unit, the air around him felt like a funeral shroud for his old life. Inside the incubator, his daughter, a fragile 4-pound miracle named Yoon-hee, was a tangle of wires and soft, rhythmic beeps. She was too small, born of a body that had been starved and a spirit that had been broken, but she was alive. And as long as she drew breath, the chairman of the Hwarang Syndicate could no longer exist. He looked down at his hands. The skin of his knuckles was split, the dried blood of the Namgu scavengers still embedded in the creases of his palms. He had spent 15 years building a crown of thorns and iron, thinking that absolute power was the only way to ensure he would never be hurt again. But power had been the very thing that drove Seo-Yeon into the shadows. Power was the reason his daughter was fighting for her life behind a pane of glass instead of sleeping in a cradle at home. Sang-hoon approached him, his footsteps heavy and hesitant on the linoleum. "Chairman, the board is assembled at the headquarters. They are demanding an explanation for the lockdown of the hospital and the unauthorized war with the Namgu crew. Kangdi's family is calling for a tribunal." Jae-Min didn't turn around. He watched the way Yoon-hee's tiny chest rose and fell. "Let them demand. Tell the directors I will be there in an hour. Tell them the king is coming to settle his accounts." "Sir, they are armed. They think you've gone soft because of the woman," Sang-hoon warned, his voice a low rumble of concern. "I haven't gone soft, Sang-hoon," Jae-Min said, finally turning, his gray eyes looking like sun-bleached bone. "I've gone certain." The Hwarang Syndicate headquarters was a monolith of black glass and polished granite in the heart of Seoul's financial district. Inside the top-floor boardroom, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the palpable tension of men who lived and died by the sword. 12 directors, the architects of the syndicate's billion-dollar empire, sat around a table that had seen more death warrants signed than business contracts. When the double doors swung open, Jae-Min didn't enter with his usual entourage. He walked in alone, his suit jacket discarded, His white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the tattoos of the Hwarang, the ancient lineage of warriors he had led into the gutter of organized crime. Chairman, Director O, the eldest of the council, began with a sneer. We've had reports of a massacre at the medical center. You've brought the heat of the national police and the wrath of Busan down on us for a waitress and a premature brat. This is not the leadership we agreed upon. Jae-Min walked to the head of the table, but he didn't sit. He leaned his hands on the polished wood, looking at each man in turn. That waitress is the mother of the Hwarang heir, and that brat is my daughter. If any of you speak of them with that tone again, you won't leave this room to see the sunset. A younger director laughed, a sharp, nervous sound. And what now? You expect us to follow a man who is distracted by a nursery. The syndicate needs a leader, Jae-Min, not a father. You're right, Jae-Min said, and the room went deathly quiet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy platinum signet ring, the seal of the chairman. He let it fall onto the table, where it clattered and rolled before settling in front of Director O. The Hwarang needs a leader who is willing to burn the world for a ledger. I am no longer that man. The shock in the room was a physical thing. In the history of the Underworld, no one walked away from the crown. You were either carried out in a box or you ruled until your heart stopped. You're stepping down, O whispered, his eyes greedily tracking the ring. You're giving it all up for her. Not giving it up, Jae-Min corrected, his voice dropping to a terrifying subsonic hum. I'm taking it apart. As of this moment, the Hwarang Syndicate is being liquidated. The legitimate holdings, the shipping, the construction, the real estate are being transitioned into a blind trust for the benefit of the medical center and the orphanages of Seoul. The dark side of the business. The drugs, the extortion, the Namgu alliances. I've already turned the ledgers over to the prosecution's office. The room erupted. Men scrambled to their feet, hands reaching for the weapons concealed beneath their Italian silk blazers. You've betrayed us, O screamed. You've signed our death warrants. I've signed your retirement, Jae-Min said, not moving an inch as a dozen muzzles were leveled at his chest. Sang-hoon. The monitors on the boardroom wall flickered to life. They showed the hallways outside, now filled with the Special Operations Unit of the Seoul Police. Jae-Min had made a deal, the kind of deal that would make him a pariah to the underworld, but a ghost to the law. He had given them the syndicate on a silver platter in exchange for total immunity and a new life for his family. The police are in the lobby, Jae-Min said, his voice calm as he adjusted his cufflinks. They aren't here for me. I'm the star witness. They're here for the men who blocked my wife's bank accounts. They're here for the men who authorized the hit on the hospital. He looked at Director O, whose face had turned a sickly shade of gray. I know it was you who helped my sister, Hana. I know you thought that by removing Seo-Yeon, you could control me. You thought her love was my weakness. Jae-Min stepped closer to the old man, the heat of his rage finally breaking through the ice. You were wrong. Her love was the only thing keeping me from being the monster you all wanted me to be. Without her, I have no reason to be merciful. The doors burst open. The sound of flashbangs and the shouting of tactical teams filled the air. In the chaos, Jae-Min didn't look back. He walked through the smoke and the shouting, a man who had successfully broken his own crown. He had purged the syndicate, not by leading it, but by destroying the very foundation it sat upon. He had made the world safe for his daughter by setting fire to the only world he had ever known. An hour later, he was back at the hospital. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a profound, hollow exhaustion. He pushed open the door to Seo-Yeon's private room. She was awake, propped up against the pillows, her skin looking a fraction more hydrated, though her eyes were still haunted by the violence of the night. It's over, he said, sitting in the chair beside her bed. He reached out and took her hand, his thumb tracing the space where her wedding ring used to be. What did you do, Jae-Min? She asked, her voice a mere whisper. I broke it, he said. The Hwarang is gone, the enemies are in cages, there is no more chairman, there is just me. Seo-Yeon looked at him, searching his face for the shadow of the man who had forced her to sign those papers 18 months ago. She saw the scars, the fatigue, and the absolute, unwavering devotion. For the first time, she didn't see a lord of crime. She saw the boy who had once promised her the world, and the man who had finally realized that she was the world. "You gave up everything," she said. "I gave up a prison," he replied. "I kept the only things that matter." He leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers. "They told me she's doing well. They might take her off the ventilator by morning. She has your chin, Seo-Yeon. She looks like she's already planning to argue with me." Seo-Yeon let out a small, broken laugh, the sound a beautiful, jarring note in the quiet room. She squeezed his hand, not the tentative squeeze of a victim, but the firm grip of a partner. "She'll win," Seo-Yeon said, "just like I did." Jae-Min closed his eyes, the weight of the last 8 months finally lifting. The breaking of the crown hadn't been a defeat, it was the ultimate victory. He had traded his power for peace, his empire for a family, and his name for a chance to be a father. As the sun began to rise over a soul that no longer belonged to him, Kang Jae-Min finally understood that true strength wasn't in how many men you could command, but in the courage to walk away from it all for a 4-pound girl, and the woman who had survived the dark to bring her home. The transition from the roar of gunfire to the sterile, rhythmic humming of the recovery wing was a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. Jae-Min sat in a hard plastic chair beside Seo-Yeon's bed, his shoulders slumped, his shadow cast long and jagged against the white tile floor by the early morning sun. He had dismantled an empire and faced down the ghosts of his past, but as he watched the steady rise and fall of Seo-Yeon's chest, he felt smaller than he ever had in the high-backed leather chair of the Hwarang boardroom. The door to the room glided open with a soft hiss. A nurse entered, pushing a clear plastic bassinet. The small bundle inside was barely visible beneath the layers of pink-striped hospital blankets, but to Jae-Min, it was the only thing in the room that held any light. "She's past all her immediate vitals, Chairman," the nurse whispered, her eyes showing a flicker of the awe the entire hospital felt for the man who had stood as a lone sentinel in their hallways. "Her breathing is strong for 34 weeks. She's a fighter." Jae-Min stood up, his legs feeling heavy, like they were made of lead. He approached the bassinet with the same cautious, predatory grace he used to enter a rival's territory, but his breath hitched as he looked down. She was so small. Her skin was a delicate, translucent pink, and her tiny hands were curled into defiant little fists near her face. "Would you like to hold her?" the nurse asked. Jae-Min froze. He looked at his hands, hands that had broken bones, hands that had signed away lives, hands that were still stained with the faint, metallic scent of the night's violence despite the scrubbing he'd given them. I might break her." "She's sturdier than she looks," the nurse encouraged, gently lifting the bundle and gesturing for Jae-Min to crook his arm. As the weight of his daughter settled against his chest, the last of the chairman's armor crumbled into ash. She was warm, an incredible living heat that seeped through his shirt and into his very bones. She shifted, a tiny, instinctive movement of her head against the crook of his elbow, and then it happened. The first cry. It wasn't the thin, frail sound he had heard in the hallway during the heat of battle. This was a sharp, demanding, and vibrantly alive sound. It was a protest against the coldness of the world, a declaration of existence that shattered the quiet of the room. Jae-Min's eyes blurred. He had heard the screams of men begging for mercy and the silence of those who had lost everything. But this sound, this raw, unfiltered expression of life, was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. A single tear, hot and heavy, escaped his eye and tracked through the dust and dried blood on his cheek, falling onto the edge of the baby's blanket. "I have you," he whispered, his voice cracking, stripped of all its authority. "I have you, Yoon-hee. I promise the world will never touch you, not while I'm breathing." "She has your eyes." A weak, melodic voice came from the bed. Jae-Min turned to see Seo-Yeon watching them. She looked exhausted, her hair damp with sweat and her lips pale, but the smile on her face was the most genuine thing he had seen in 18 months. He walked to the bedside, kneeling so she could see the face of the child she had nearly died to protect. "She has your strength," Jae-Min countered softly. Resting his free hand over Seo-Yeon's, "She fought through the dark to get here, just like you." Seo-Yeon reached out, her finger trembling as she touched the baby's velvet-soft cheek. The infant's crying subsided into a series of small, contented huffs. "You stayed," Seo-Yeon breathed, her gaze lifting to his. "In the hall, I heard you. I heard the music stop and the world go quiet." "The music didn't just stop, Seo-Yeon. I broke the record," he said, a ghost of his old smirk appearing, though it was tempered by a new, profound humility. "There is no more Hwarang, no more syndicate, no more reasons for you to look over your shoulder." He leaned in, the three of them forming a closed circle in the center of the sterile room. For the first time in his life, Jae-Min didn't feel the need to watch the door. He didn't feel the phantom weight of a weapon at his hip. He felt only the softness of his daughter's breath and the warmth of his wife's hand. "This is the first day," he said, his forehead resting against Seo-Yeon's. "The first day of a life where I am just a man who loves you. No titles, no blood, just us." The baby let out another small, sharp cry, a brief exclamation as if agreeing with the terms. Jae-Min chuckled, a sound that felt foreign but right in his chest. He realized then that his vulnerability wasn't his downfall, it was his salvation. The man who could make the underworld tremble was now completely at the mercy of a girl who couldn't even lift her own head. "She's hungry," Seo-Yeon noted, her maternal instincts already sharp and focused. As Jae-Min handed the baby back to her, watching the instinctual, tender way they bonded, he felt a peace he hadn't known was possible. He walked to the window and pulled back the heavy curtains. The sun was fully up now, illuminating a Seoul that looked different, softer, less like a battlefield and more like a playground. The first cry had signaled the end of the chairman's reign, but it was the beginning of a story he actually wanted to tell. He stood by the bed, a silent, weeping guardian who had finally found something worth more than power. He was a father. He was a husband. And as he watched Seo-Yeon cradle their daughter, he knew he would spend every remaining breath ensuring that the only tears shed in this family would be ones of joy. The ghost of the Hwarang was dead. Long live the father. The penthouse balcony was no longer a cold observation deck for a man surveying his battlegrounds. Instead, it had been softened by the presence of life. Pots of vibrant blooming azaleas, a small wooden rocking chair, and the soft, rhythmic sound of a baby's breathing. Below them, Seoul continued its frantic, neon-lit dance, but up here, 80 floors above the syndicate's ghost, the air felt clean. Jae-Min stood at the railing, but he wasn't looking at the city. He was looking at Seo-Yeon. She was wrapped in a soft, cream-colored cardigan, her hair pulled back in a loose bun, looking more radiant in her recovery than she ever had in the diamonds he used to buy her. In her arms, Yoon-hee was a small, warm weight, her tiny face pressed against her mother's chest as she drifted in the deep, effortless sleep of the innocent. The transition from chairman to father had not been a quiet one. The legal battles had been grueling, and the process of liquidating a criminal empire had required a different kind of ruthlessness, one that involved forensic accountants instead of enforcers. But Jae-Min had stayed true to his vow. He had traded his shadow for the light, and while his name was still whispered in the back alleys of Gangnam, it was now spoken of as a cautionary tale, the man who walked away from the crown for a heart. "She's finally asleep," Seo-Yeon whispered, her voice a soothing balm that still made Jae-Min's heart skip. "She has your stubbornness, you know. She refused to close her eyes until she saw you come through the door." Jae-Min walked over, his steps silent on the cedar decking. He wrapped his arms around Seo-Yeon from behind, pulling her and the baby into the protective circle of his embrace. He rested his chin on her shoulder, his breath warm against her skin. "I was only gone for 3 hours. The settlement meetings took longer than expected." "And?" Seo-Yeon asked, leaning back into him. "And it's done," Jae-Min said, a profound sense of relief washing over him. "The trust is finalized. The legitimate businesses are under new management and the rest is a matter for the courts. We are officially ordinary citizens, Seo-Yeon. No one is coming for us. No one is waiting for a slip-up." Seo-Yeon turned in his arms, the baby shifting but not waking. She searched his face, seeing the way the hard lines around his eyes had finally begun to soften. The cold, obsidian gaze of the Mafia lord had been replaced by a quiet, steady devotion. "Do you miss it?" she asked softly. The power, the way people used to move when you walked into a room. Jae-Min looked down at Yoon-hee, then back at Seo-Yeon. He thought of the nightclub, the whiskey bottles, the blood-stained hospital floor, and the 6 months of agonizing silence that had nearly cost him everything. He thought of the proper life his family had tried to force on him and the hollow victory of a throne built on fear. "I never had power until now," he said, his voice thick with conviction. "Real power isn't making people disappear with a phone call. It's the courage to be the man you deserve. It's the strength to be vulnerable enough to hold her without breaking her. I don't miss the syndicate, Seo-Yeon. I only regret that I didn't find this home sooner." He reached out, his thumb grazing Yoon-hee's velvet-soft cheek. The infant let out a tiny, contented sigh in her sleep, her small hand reaching up to grasp Jae-Min's finger. The most dangerous man in Seoul was now a captive to a 3-month-old girl's grip, and he wouldn't have it any other way. They stood there for a long time, watching the stars compete with the city lights. This was the new syndicate, a union of 3, bound not by blood oaths and silence, but by sacrifice and a second chance that had been forged in the fire. The Lord of Crime had finally found his home, not in a fortress or a title, but in the quiet breathing of his family and the steady, beating heart of the woman who had never stopped believing he was worth saving. Some love stories are born in the sunlight, but theirs had been carved out of the darkest corners of the underworld. It was a story of a man who realized that his greatest protection was his presence, not his power, and a woman who learned that sometimes the safest place to fall is into the arms of the man the rest of the world fears. "I love you," Jae-Min whispered, the words no longer a secret but a vow. "I know," Seo-Yeon replied, resting her head on his chest. "I've always known." As the moon rose over the Han River, the shadows of the Hwarang finally vanished, leaving behind nothing but the peaceful world they had built together. The dark chapters were over. The most beautiful ending had just begun. The legacy of Kang Jae-Min and Han Seo-Yeon is not merely one of survival, but a testament to the fact that the architecture of our lives can always be rebuilt. Their story serves as a profound reminder that true protection is not found in the height of one's walls or the depth of one's secrets, but in the transparency of one's heart. A primary lesson of their journey is that love, in its purest form, requires the courage to be vulnerable. Jae-Min spent years believing that power was a shield, only to realize that his strength was the very thing that isolated him from the people he was trying to save. He learned that you cannot truly protect someone while keeping them at arm's length. To guard a heart, you must be willing to let your own be seen. The crown he wore was never a symbol of his authority, but a barrier to his humanity. By breaking it, he didn't lose his power, he gained a purpose. For Seo-Yeon, the lesson was one of self-worth and resilience. She moved from the shadows of a liability to the center of a family, proving that one's value is not determined by the lineage they are born into or the mistakes of their past. She taught us that walking away from a toxic environment, even into hardship, is an act of supreme strength, not weakness. Her silence was not a surrender. It was a sanctuary for her child until the world was ready to receive them both. Ultimately, their story proves that no matter how dark the chapter or how deep the betrayal, second chances are forged through truth and sacrifice. It reminds us that the most dangerous man in the world can become the safest place to fall, provided he is willing to lay down his weapons for a pair of tiny, grasping hands. As the sun sets on the Hwarang Syndicate and rises on the family at the penthouse, the final takeaway remains: power is fleeting, and empires eventually crumble to dust, but the bonds we choose to honor are the only things that truly endure. Sometimes, the darkest nights are simply the prologue to the most beautiful morning you have ever seen. Your story is not defined by the wars you've fought, but by the peace you finally have the courage to keep.